In the dark corridors of 1930s German High Command, there existed a psychological glitch that would eventually lead to the creation of the most terrifying machine ever to crawl across the earth. The problem was simple: the French Maginot Line. It was a chain of fortifications so dense, so deep, and so heavily armored that traditional artillery was essentially useless against it. The German military didn't just need a bigger gun, they needed a weapon that broke the fundamental laws of ballistics, a machine that could punch through 7 meters of reinforced concrete from 30 miles away. This obsession birthed a monster that would be known as the Schwerer Gustav, a weapon so massive it redefined what engineering actually meant. To understand the scale of this mechanical glitch, you have to stop thinking of the Gustav as a gun and start thinking of it as a moving factory of death. While the world's most advanced tanks of the time, like the early Panzers, weighed a mere 20 or 30 tons, the Schwerer Gustav weighed a staggering 1,350 tons. It was a scale glitch in the most literal sense. It was so heavy that the earth itself couldn't support its weight on a standard set of railway tracks. If you tried to park this machine on a normal train line, the steel rails would snap like toothpicks and the gun would sink into the mud. To solve this, the engineers at Krupp had to invent a completely new way to move. They designed a unique parallel double-track system, meaning the Gustav didn't just ride on one set of rails, it sat across 4 tracks simultaneously, supported by a massive specialized chassis that distributed its weight across dozens of axles. This created a logistical nightmare that was unlike anything seen in the history of warfare. Whenever the Gustav moved, a specialized team of thousands of laborers had to be sent ahead to lay miles of reinforced double-track rail, often carving paths through forests and hillsides just to accommodate the beast's width. This was the first hint that the Gustav was a glitch in military logic. It required more effort to move the gun than it did to fight the actual war. The barrel alone was a masterpiece of terrifying metallurgy, a steel tube nearly 100 feet long that was so wide a full-grown man could crawl into it with ease. Casting a barrel of this size was thought to be impossible because the cooling process for that much molten steel usually resulted in cracks and structural glitches. But Krupp's engineers pushed the limits of physics, creating a rifled bore that could withstand the violent explosion of over a ton of gunpowder in a single blast. The ammunition for this monster was equally insane. The Gustav fired 2 types of projectiles, a high-explosive shell weighing nearly 5 tons and a concrete piercing shell that weighed 7 tons. To put that in perspective, every time the Gustav fired, it was essentially launching a fully loaded African elephant through the air at supersonic speeds. The propellant required to move this mass was so volatile that the gunners had to monitor the temperature of the gunpowder with obsessive precision. Even a slight deviation in heat would change the ballistics enough to miss a city-sized target. But the most incredible glitch was the recoil. When the 80-centimeter gun fired, the force was so monumental that the entire 1,350-ton structure would be shoved backward, despite being locked on to its double tracks. The shock wave from the muzzle blast was known to shatter windows for miles and could literally knock a man unconscious if he stood too close to the firing platform. This wasn't just a weapon, it was a localized earthquake. Because the gun was so massive, it couldn't actually aim in the traditional sense. The barrel could move up and down to change the range, but to turn the gun left or right, the entire railway track had to be built on a curve. The crew would then use 2 specialized 1,000-horsepower locomotives to slowly push the 1,350-ton Titan along the curved track until it was pointed at the correct set of coordinates. It was a process that took hours of meticulous calculation and mechanical labor just for a single shot. The human element was perhaps the strangest part of this engineering glitch. The Gustav wasn't operated by a squad or even a company. It was operated by an entire secret city. A full battalion of 500 men was needed just to fire the weapon, but the total support staff numbered over 2,000 people. This included specialized intelligence units to spot targets, anti-aircraft divisions to protect it from the sky, and even a dedicated laboratory of chemists to test the air pressure and gunpowder stability. It was a massive, vulnerable, and incredibly slow glitch in the blitzkrieg strategy. While the rest of the German army was moving at lightning speed with tanks and motorized infantry, the Gustav was a ghost of the past, a monument to the static, heavy metal obsession of the 19th century, scaled up to a level that science could barely handle. It was the ultimate dark dock secret, a weapon that the world didn't believe could exist until it finally appeared on the horizon, moving like a slow steel mountain towards its first victim. The engineers had succeeded in building the impossible, but in doing so, they had created a machine so large that it threatened to collapse under its own logistical weight before it even fired its first shot in anger. The stage was set for the siege of Sevastopol, where this engineering glitch would finally meet the reality of combat, and the world would realize that some things are simply too big to be stopped, but also too big to survive.
By the summer of 1942, the Schwerer Gustav had ceased to be an engineering curiosity and had become a terrifying reality on the edge of the Crimean Peninsula. The target was Sevastopol, a Soviet fortress city so heavily defended it was considered the most fortified place on the planet. For the Soviet defenders, the glitch in their defense was something they couldn't possibly have prepared for. They had built their bunkers deep into the coastal cliffs, protected by layers of reinforced concrete and tens of meters of solid natural rock. They believed they were subterranean ghosts, untouchable by any shell in the German arsenal. But as the sun rose over the dusty plains of the Crimea, the Gustav was finally assembled and ready to unleash a level of violence that defied the laws of traditional ballistics. This was the moment of the earth-shaker. The German gunners loaded a 7-ton concrete-piercing shell, a projectile taller than 2 men, into the breach using a specialized crane system. When the firing command was given, the explosion of over a ton of propellant was so colossal that the muzzle flash could be seen for miles, and the sound was described by survivors not as a bang, but as the sky itself being torn in half. The most famous glitch in military history occurred during the shelling of Siberia, an ammunition magazine buried under Severina Bay. This facility wasn't just hidden, it was encased in 30 meters of solid natural rock under the seabed. It was the safe house for the Soviets' entire regional ammunition supply. The Gustav fired a single massive shell that screamed across the sky at supersonic speeds. Because of its incredible weight and narrow profile, the shell didn't explode when it hit the surface of the bay. Instead, it used its 7 tons of momentum to act like a kinetic spear, punching through the water, through the seabed, and through the entire 30-meter ceiling of solid natural rock before detonating inside the magazine. The resulting explosion was a geological event. The sea literally rose into the sky as the underwater magazine vaporized, sending a shockwave that leveled buildings across the harbor and disabled every Soviet defensive position in the sector. It was a physics glitch made manifest. A single shot from 30 miles away had achieved what thousands of standard bombers and months of infantry charges could not. The Soviet command was in a total panic. They were being hit by a weapon they couldn't see, couldn't hear until it was too late, and most importantly, couldn't defend against. There was no bunker deep enough and no steel plate thick enough to stop a 7-ton spike falling from the stratosphere. During the siege, the Gustav fired 48 rounds, and with every shot, The geological landscape of Sevastopol changed. Entire hillsides were reshaped, and the dust from the pulverized concrete was so thick it blocked out the sun. This was the pinnacle of the monster gun era, a machine that turned the world into a playground for giants. But while the Gustav was erasing fortresses, it was also erasing its own lifespan. With every shot, the inner lining of the barrel was being scorched and scraped away by the massive shells. By the end of the siege, the barrel was effectively dead, its rifling worn smooth by the sheer friction of its own power. The weapon that had just broken the back of a Soviet stronghold was now a hollow, useless tube of steel. The glitch of absolute power had reached its limit. As the smoke cleared from the ruins of Sevastopol, the Germans were left with a terrifying realization. They had the world's most powerful weapon, but it was a one-act wonder that was now too damaged to fight the rest of the war.